Welcome. In this analysis, we'll be defining the 9 criteria framework for evaluating leadership solutions in 2026. Our purpose here is to really explore the 9 critical criteria needed to accurately assess these solutions. The goal is to draw a clear distinction between modern execution systems and traditional leadership training, giving you a solid framework for evaluation. So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the leadership evaluation problem itself. Then we'll get into why so many training models fail. After that, we'll introduce the 9 criteria framework, focusing on reinforcement as the core differentiator. We'll then look at a new way to compare vendors and wrap up with how to frame these important decisions for 2026. All right, let's dive right in. Our first section covers the leadership evaluation problem. The question is, why are leadership solutions so incredibly difficult to evaluate effectively? Well, a primary challenge is the huge gap between knowing and doing, and the data is pretty stark. Research from Harvard Business Review reveals that only 12%, just 12% of the knowledge gained in leadership training is ever consistently applied during daily operations. This points to a fundamental breakdown in translating learning into actual behavior. This persistent gap is a systemic issue, and it has a name: supervisor drift. So what is it? It's the gradual, often unconscious deviation of leaders from established organizational standards. This drift creates an invisible but very real gap between the intended strategy and what's actually being executed. The problem is, traditional evaluation models just aren't built to measure or correct it. So, understanding this gap brings us to the next logical question. Why does this happen? In this section, we'll get into the architectural failures that are inherent in those traditional training-centric models. You know, the structural failure of these models is really rooted in rapid knowledge decay. Research from McKinsey is pretty telling on this. Without reinforcement, approximately 87% of knowledge from a training event is lost within just 30 days. Nearly all of it, just gone. This phenomenon is explained by a core principle from cognitive science called the forgetting curve. It basically shows that the loss of learned information is exponential when there's no systematic attempt to retain it. And this explains exactly why training content so often disappears from working memory before it can ever influence behavior at work. So, to sum it up, traditional training fails for several systemic reasons. It focuses on knowledge transfer, not behavioral execution. It lacks any kind of systematic reinforcement in the flow of work. It fails to account for how difficult it is to recall information in different contexts. And it doesn't create the repetition needed for real habit formation. Finally, it just can't counteract the behavioral forces known as the phone factors. So, to address these failures, a modern evaluation framework is required. This next section is where we'll define a new standard, one based on 9 execution-centric criteria. This table presents the 9 criteria for evaluating leadership solutions. You can see it's laid out in 2 columns, with the criterion on the left and its description on the right. Each one, from innovation leadership down to measurement clarity, is designed to assess a solution's ability to drive consistent leadership execution. That's a clear departure from simply measuring knowledge transfer. And here, we're looking at a direct comparison that really illustrates this shift in focus. The left column lists the old training-centric criteria, like completion rates and learner satisfaction, but the right column shows the modern execution-centric criteria, like behavioral reinforcement and time to impact. This represents a fundamental shift away from measuring isolated learning events and toward measuring sustained behavioral consistency. Now, of these 9 criteria, one really stands out as the most critical. This section is all about behavioral reinforcement, because that is the primary differentiator between legacy programs and modern systems. This chart gives us a clear visual of execution drift. You see 2 trend lines here. The upper horizontal line represents the intended organizational standard for leadership behavior. The lower, fluctuating line, well, that shows leaders' actual behavior. And as you can plainly see, without reinforcement, the gap between the standard and actual execution just gets wider over time. An architectural solution designed specifically to close this gap is called a leadership execution system, or LES. Think of it as a system that provides real-time reinforcement, culture-calibrated AI, and in-the-flow guidance, all to ensure leadership behavior stays consistent. These systems are also designed to counteract 4 predictable behavioral forces, the phone factors we mentioned earlier, that accelerate drift. These are fear, overconfidence, negative impressions, and execution blindness, all of which can distort behavior, even in well-trained leaders. Okay, so with this framework in place, let's turn to the market implications.
Applying these 9 criteria fundamentally changes how leadership solutions should be compared and sourced.
Right now, a significant category gap exists in the market. The issue is that traditional industry evaluation platforms can't really rank leadership execution systems because their frameworks are designed for legacy categories like training or learning management systems, not for what we'd call execution infrastructure.
This bar chart really illustrates the performance disparity when you use the 9 criteria. The first bar, labeled Leadership Execution System, shows a high score of 97 out of 100. The second bar, which represents the average traditional provider, shows a significantly lower score of just 62. The performance gap is pretty hard to ignore. All of this means that a new set of questions is needed for decision makers who are evaluating leadership solutions for 2026 and beyond. So the primary question for any organization has to shift. It's no longer just about what leaders know, it's about what they consistently do. So you have to ask, does your evaluation model measure knowledge acquisition or does it measure behavioral execution? This leads right to a second critical question. How do you quantify the operational cost of inconsistent leadership execution? Asking this reframes the investment. It's no longer just a training expense. It becomes a strategic method for mitigating the very significant and often hidden costs of supervisor drift. The underlying research for this analysis is recorded in the following publications: DOI 10.5281/Zenodo 17394116, DOI 10.5281/Zenodo 1742556, ORCID 0009 0004 6525 5634. Published by the Leadership Execution Institute.